This is part 6, the search for standard from the SE2 concepts of liberty by Isaac Berlin. There's yet another historically important approach to this topic, which by confounding liberty with her sisters, equality, and fraternity, leads to similarly illiberal conclusions. Ever since its issue was raised towards the end of the 18th century, the question of what is meant by an individual has been asked persistently and with increasing effect. Insofar as I live in society, everything that I do inevitably affects and is affected by what others do. Even Mill's strenuous effort to mark the distinction between the spheres of private social life breaks down under examination. Virtually all Mill's critics have pointed out that everything that I do may have results which will harm other human beings. Moreover, I am a social being in a deeper sense than that of interaction with others. For am I not what I am, to some degree, in virtue for what others think and feel me to be? When I ask myself what I am, and an Englishman, a Chinese, a merchant, a man of no importance, a millionaire, a convict, I found upon analysis that to possess these attributes entails being recognized as belonging to a particular group or class by other persons in my society. And this recognition is a part of the meaning of most of the terms that denote some of my most personal and permanent characteristics. I'm not disembodied reason, nor am I Robinson Crusoe, alone upon his island. It's not only that my material life depends upon interaction with other men, or that I am what I am as a result of social forces, but it's that some, perhaps all, of my ideas about myself, in particular my sense of my own moral and social identity, are intelligible only in terms of the social network in which I am. The metaphor must not be pressed too far, an element. The lack of freedom about which man or group complains amounts, as often as not, to the lack of proper recognition. I may be seeking not for what Mill would wish me to seek, namely security from coercion, arbitrary arrest, tyranny, deprivation of certain opportunities for action, or for room within which I am legally accountable to no one for my movements. Equally, I may not be seeking for the rational plan of social life, or the self-profession of a dispassionate sage. What I may seek to avoid is simply being ignored, or patronized, or despised, or being taken too much for granted. In short, not being treated as an individual, and my uniqueness insufficiently recognized, being classed as a member of some featureless amalgam, a statistical unit without identifiable, especially human features and purposes of my own. This is a degradation of what I'm fighting against, not equality for legal rights, nor liberty to do as I wish, although I may want this too, but for a condition in which I can feel that I am, because I am taken to be a responsible agent whose will is taken into consideration because I am entitled to it, even if I am attacked and persecuted for being what I am or choosing as I do. This is a hanker after standards recognition. The pros that he that is in England has a right to live, and agreed is he. A desire to be understood, and recognized, even if this means to be unpopular and disliked. The only person who can so recognize me and thereby give me the sense of being someone are the members as a society to which historically, morally, economically, and perhaps ethnically I feel that I belong. My individual self is not something which I can detach from my relation with others, or from those attributes of myself which consist in their attitude towards me. Consequently, when I demand to be liberated from, let us say, the standard for political or social dependence, what I demand is an alteration of the attitude towards me, those whose opinions and behavior help to determine my own image of myself. What is true of the individual is true of groups, social, political, economic, religious, that is, of men conscious of needs, purposes which they have as members of such groups. What all oppressed classes or nationalities as a rule demand is neither simply unhampered liberty of action for their members, nor above everything equality of social or economic opportunity, still less assignment of a place in a frictionless, organic state devised by the rational lawgiver. What they want, as often as not, is simply recognition, whether class or nation or color or race, as an independent source of human activity, as an entity with a will of its own, intending to act in accordance with it, whether it is good or legitimate or not, and not to be ruled, educated, guided with however light a hand, as being not quietly fully human, and therefore not quietly fully free. This gives a far wider and purely rationalistic sense to Kant's paternalism is the greatest despotism imaginable. Parentalism is despotic, not because it is more oppressive than naked, brutal, unenlightened tyranny, not merely because it ignores a transcendental reason embodied in me, but because it is an insult to my conception of myself as a human being, determined to make my own life in accordance with my own, not necessarily rational or benevolent purposes, and above all, entitled to be recognized as such by others. If I'm not so recognized, and I may fail to recognize, I may doubt my own claim to be a fully independent human being. For what I am is, in large part, determined by what I feel and think, and what I feel and think is determined by the feeling and the thought prevailing in the society to which I belong, of which, in Bergson's, I form not an isolable atom, but an ingredient, to use a palace, but indispensable metaphor in a social pattern. I may feel unfree in the sense of not being recognized as a self-governing individual human being, but I may feel as also a member of an unrecognized or insufficiently respected group. Then I wish for the emancipation of my entire class or community or nation or race or profession. So much can I desire this, that I may, in my bitter longing for standards, prefer to be bullied and misgoverned by some member of my own race or social class, by whom I am nevertheless recognized as a man, and a rival, that is, as an equal to being well and tolerantly treated as someone from some higher and remote group, who does not recognize me for what I wish I feel myself to be. This is the heart of the great cry for recognition on the part of both individuals and the groups that in our own day, professions and classes, nations and races. Although I may not get negative liberty in the hands of the members of my own society, yet they are members of my own group. They understand me, and I understand them. And this understanding creates within me the sense of being somebody in the world. It is this desire for reciprocal recognition that leads the most authoritarian democracy to be, at times, consciously preferred by its members to the most enlightened oligarchies, oligarchies, or sometimes calls some member of some newly liberated Asian or African state complaintless today, when he is rudely treated by members of his own race or nations, and when he was governed by some cautious, just, gentle, well-meaning administrators from outside. Unless this phenomenon is grasped, the ideas and behavior for entire peoples who, in Mill's sense of the word, suffer deprivation of elementary human rights, and who with every appearance of sincerity speaks of enjoying more freedom than when they possess a wider measure for these rights, becomes an unintelligible paradox. It is not with individual liberty, either the negative or the positive senses of the word, that this desire for standards recognition can easily be identified. It's something no less profoundly needed and passionately fought for by human beings. It's something akin to, but not itself freedom, although it entails an active freedom for the entire group. It is more closely related to solidarity, fraternity, mutual understanding, need for association on equal terms, all of which are sometimes, but misleadingly, called social freedom. Social and political terms are necessarily weak. The attempt to make the vocabulary of politics too precise may render it useless. But it's no service to the truth to loosen usage beyond necessity. The essence of the notion of liberty, both in the positive and the negative senses, is a holding off of something or someone of others who trespass on my field or assert the authority over me of obsessions, fears, neuroses, irrational forces, intruders, and despots of one kind or another. The desire for recognition, desire for something different, for union, closer understanding, integration of interest, a life of common dependence and common sacrifice, is only the confusion of desire for liberty with its profoundly universal craving for standards understanding, further confounded by being identified with the notion of a social self-direction, where the self is liberty that is no longer the individual but the social whole, that makes it possible for men, while submitting to the authority for oligarchs or dictators, to claim that this is in some sense liberates them. Much has been written on the fallacy of recognizing social groups as being literally persons or cells whose control and discipline of their members is no more than self-discipline, voluntary self-control, which leaves the individual agent free. But even on the organic view, would it be natural or desirable to call the demand for recognition and standards a demand for liberty in some certain sense? It's true that the group from which recognition is sought must itself have a sufficient measure for negative freedom, from control by any outside authority. Otherwise, recognition by it will not give the claimant the standard he seeks. But there is a struggle for higher standards, a wish to escape from an inferior position to be called a struggle for liberty. It is mere pedantry to confine this word to the mean senses discussed above, or are we, as I suspect, in danger of calling any improvement is a social situation favored by a human being an increase of the liberty, and will this not render this term so weak and distended as to make it virtually useless? Yet we can't simply dismiss this case as a mere confusion of the notion of freedom with that of standards, or solidarity, or fraternity, or equality, or some combination of this. For the craving of standards, in some certain respects, were close to the desire to be an independent agent. When we refuse this goal, the title of liberty, it would be a shallow view that assumes that analogies between individuals and groups, organic metaphors, or several senses of the word liberty, are mere fallacies, to either to Assertions of likeness between entities in respect to which they are unlike, or simple semantic confusion. What is wanted by those who are prepared to barter their own and other liberty for individual action for the standards of the group and their own standards within the group is not simply a surrender for liberty for the sake of security, some assured place in the harmonious hierarchy in which all men, all classes know their place and are prepared to exchange the painful privilege of choosing the burden of freedom for the peace and comfort and relative mindlessness of a authoritarian or totalitarian structure. No doubt there are such men, such desires, and no doubt such surrenders of individual liberty can occur, and indeed has often occurred. But it is a profound misunderstanding of the temper of our times to assume that this is what makes nationalism or Marxism attractive to nations which have been ruled by alien masters, or to classes whose lives were directed by other classes in a semi-feudal or some other hierarchically organized regime. What they seek is more akin to what Mill called pagan self-assertion. But in a collective, socialized form, indeed, much what he says about his own reason for desiring liberty, the value that he puts on boldness and nonconformity, on the searching for the individual's own values in the face of the prevailing opinion, on strong the self-reliant personality free from the leading strings of the official lawgivers and instructors of society, has little enough to do with his conception of freedom as non-interference. But we deal with the desire of men not to have their personalities set and too low a value, assumed to be incapable of autonomous, original, authentic behavior, even if such a behavior is to be met with opprobrium or social restrictions or inhibitory legislation. This wish to assert the personality of my class, or group, or nation is connected both with the answer to the question what is to be the area for authority, for the group must not be interfered with by outside masters, and even more closely with the answer to the question who is to govern us, govern well or badly, liberally or oppressively, but above all, who? And such answers as by representative elected by my own and others' untrammeled choice, or all of us gathered together in regular assemblies, or the best, or the wisest, or the nation as embodied in this or those persons or institutions, or the divine leader are answers that are logically and times are politically and socially independent what extent of net liberty I demand for my own or my group's activities, provided the answer to who shall govern me is somebody or something which I can represent as my own, as something which belongs to me, or to whom I belong. I can, by using words which convey fraternity and solidarity, as well as some part of the connotation of the possible sense of the word freedom, which is difficult to specify more precisely, describe it as a hybrid form of freedom, at any rate, as an ideal which is perhaps more prominent than any other in the world today, yet one which no existing term seems precise to fit. Those who purchase it and the prices are negative, Millennium freedom certainly claim to be liberated by this means in this confused but ardently felt sense, whose service is perfect freedom, can in this way be secularized as the state or the nation or the race or an assembly or the dictator or my family or a million or I myself can be substituted for the deity without thereby rendering the word freedom wholly meaningless. No doubt, every interpretation of the word liberty, however unusual, must include a minimum for what I call the negative liberty. This must be an area in which I'm not frustrated. No society literally suppresses all the liberty of its members. A being who is prevented by others from doing anything at all on his own is not a moral agent at all, and could not either legally or morally be regarded as a human being, even if a physiologist or a biologist or even a psychologist felt inclined to classify him as a man. But the fathers of liberalism, Mill and Constant, want more than this minimum. They demand a maximum degree of non-interference compatible with the minimum demands for social life. It seems unlikely that this extreme demand for liberty has ever made by any but a small minority of highly civilized and self-conscious human beings. The bulk of humanity has certainly at the most time been prepared to sacrifice this to other goals: security, standards, prosperity, power, virtue, rewards in the next world, or justice, equality, fraternity, and many other values which appear wholly or in part incompatible with the attainment of the greatest degree of individual liberty, and certainly do not need it as a precondition for their own realization. This is not demand for Lebensraum for each individual that has stimulated the rebellions and wars of liberation for which men were ready to die in the past, or indeed in the present. Men who have fought for freedom commonly fought for the right to be governed by themselves, or the representatives, sternly governed if need be, like the Spartans, with little individual liberty, but in a manner which allows them to participate, or at any rate to believe that they were participating in the legislation and administration of their collective lives. The men who have made revolutions have, as often as not, made by liberty no more than the conquest of power and authority by a given sect of believers in a doctrine, or by a class, or by some other social group, old or new. The victory certainly frustrated those whom they ousted, and sometimes repressed, enslaved, or exterminated vast numbers of human beings. Yet such revolutionaries have usually felt necessary to argue that despite this represented the party for liberty or true liberty by claiming universality for the ideal, which is the real selves of even those who resist them were also alleged to be seeking, although they were held to have lost their way to the goal, or to have mistaken the goal itself owing to some moral or spiritual blindness. All this has little to do with Mill's notion of liberty as limited only by the danger of doing harm to others. It is the non-recognition of this psychological and political fact which lurks behind the apparent ambiguity of the term liberty, that has perhaps blinded some contemporary liberals to the world in which they live. The plea is clear, the cause is just, but they do not allow for the variety of basic human needs, and for the ingenuity with which men can prove to their own satisfaction that the route to one ideal also leads to its contrary. Part 7. Liberty and sovereignty. The French Revolution, like all great revolutions, was unless in its Jacobin form such an eruption of the desire for policy freedom or collective self-direction on the part of a large body of Frenchmen who felt liberated as a nation, even though the result was for a good many of them a severe restriction of individual freedoms. Rousseau has spoken exultantly of the fact that the laws of liberty might prove to be more austere than the yoke of a tyranny. Tyranny is a service to human masters. The law cannot be a tyrant. Rousseau does not mean by liberty the negative freedom of the individual not to be interfered with within a defined area, but as a possession by all and not merely by some of the fully qualified members of society of a share in the public power, which is entitled to interfere with every aspect of every citizen's life. The liberals of the first half of the 19th century correctly foresaw that liberty in this positive sense could easily destroy too many of the negative liberties that they held sacred. They pointed out that the sovereignty of the people could easily destroy that of individuals. Mill explained patiently and unanswerably that the government by the people were not, in his sense, necessarily freedom at all. But those who govern are not necessarily the same people as those who are governed. A democratic self-government is not the government of each by himself, at the best of each by the rest. Mill and his disciples spoke of the tyranny of the majority and the tyranny of the prevailing feeling and opinion, and saw no great difference between that and any other kind of tyranny which encroaches upon man's activities beyond the secret frontiers of private life. No one saw the conflict between the two types of liberty better, or expressed it more clearly than Benjamin Constant. He pointed out that the transference by a successful rising of the unlimited authority, commonly called the sovereignty, from one set of hands to another, does not increase liberty, but merely shifts the burden of slavery. He reasonably asked why a man should deeply care whether he is crushed by a popular government or by a monarch, or even by a set of oppressive laws. He saw that the main problem for those who desire negative individual freedom is not who wields this authority, but how much authority should be placed in any set of hands. For unlimited authority in anybody's grasp was bound, he believed, sooner or later, to destroy somebody. He maintained that usually man protested against this, and that is said for governors as oppressive, when the real cause of oppression lay in the mere fact that the accumulation of power itself, whenever it might happen to be, since the liberty was endangered by the mere existence of absolute authority as such. Not the arm that is unjust, he wrote, but the weapon that is too heavy. Some weights are too heavy for the human hand. Democracy may disarm a given oligarchy, a given privileged individual set of individuals, but it can still crush individuals as mercilessly as any person ruler. In an essay comparing the liberty for the moderns with that of the ancients, he said that an equal right to oppress or interfere is not equivalent to liberty, nor does universal consent to laws of a liberty somehow miraculously preserve it merely by being universal or by being consent. If I consent to be oppressed, or acquaintances in my condition with detachment or irony, am I the less oppressed? I sell myself into slavery, am I the less a slave? If I committed suicide, am I the less dead because I have taken my own life freely? Popular government is a spasmodic tyranny. Monarchy a mere efficiently centralized despotism. Constant saw in Rousseau the most dangerous enemy of individual liberty. He declared that by giving myself to all, I give myself to none. Constant could not see why, even though the sovereign is everybody, it should not oppress one of the members' its indivisible self, if it is so decided. I may, of course, prefer to be deprived of my liberties by assembly or by a family, on a family, on a class in which I am a minority. It may give me opportunity one day of persuading others to do for me what is to which I feel I'm entitled. But to be deprived of my liberty at the hands of my family or friends or fellow citizens is to be deprived of it just as effectively. Hobbes was at any rate more candid. He did not pretend that a sovereign does not enslave. He justified the slavery, but at least did not have the effrontery to call it a freedom. Throughout the 19th century, liberal thinkers maintained that if liberty involved limiting upon the powers of any man to force me to do what I did not or might not wish to do, then whatever the ideal in the name of which I am coerced, I am not free. That the doctrine of absolute sovereignty was a tyrannical doctrine in itself. If I wish to preserve my liberty, it's not enough to say that it must not be violated unless someone or some other, the absolute ruler or the popular assembly or the king in parliament, or the judges or some combination of authorities, or the laws themselves, or the laws may be oppressive, authorizes a violation. I must establish a society in which there must be some frontiers of freedom which nobody should be permitted to cross. Different names or natures may be given to the rules that determine the frontiers. They may be called natural rights, or the word of God, or natural law, or the demands of utility, or for the permanent interests of man. I may believe them to be valid priori, or assert them to be my own ultimate ends, or the ends of my society or culture. What these rules or commandments will have in common is that they are accepted so widely and grounded so deeply in the actual nature of man that they have developed through history as to be, by now, an essential part of what we mean by being a normal human being. General belief in the inviolability of a minimal extent of individual liberty entails some such absolute stand, for it is clear it has little to hope. For from the rule of majorities, democracy as such is logically uncommitted to it, and historically has at times failed to protect it, while remaining faithful to its own principles. Few governments, it has been observed, have found much difficulty in causing the subject to generate any will that the government wanted. The triumph of despotism is to force the slave to declare themselves free. It may need no force. The slave may proclaim their freedom quite sincerely, but they are nonetheless slaves. Pampers, the chief value for liberals for political positive rights of participating in the government is as a means for protecting what they hold to be ultimate value, namely individual negative liberty. But if democracies can, without ceasing to be democratic, suppress freedom, at least as liberals have used the word, what will make society truly free? For Constant Mill, Tocqueville, the liberal tradition to which they belong, no society is free unless it is governed by, at any rate, two interrelated principles. First, that no power, but only rights, can be regarded as absolute, so that all men, whatever power governs them, have absolute right to refuse or behave inhumanly. As second, that there are frontiers, not artificially drawn, within which man should be inviolable, but the frontiers being defined in terms of rules so long and widely accepted that the observance has entered into the very conception of what is to be a normal human being, and therefore also for what is to act inhumanly or insanely, rules which it would be absurd to say, for example, that it could be abrogated by some formal procedure on the part of some court or sovereign body. When I speak of man as being normal, and part of what I mean is that he could not break these rules easily, without a qualm of revulsion. It's such rules as these that are broken when a man is declared guilty without trial or punished under retroactive law, when children are ordered to denounce their parents, friends to betray one another, soldiers to use methods of barbarism, when men are tortured or murdered, or minorities are massacred, because they irritate the majority on a tyrant. Such acts, even if they are made legal by the sovereign, cause a horror even in these days that it springs from the recognition of the moral validity in respect of the laws of some absolute barrier to the imposition of one man's will on another. The freedom of society, on a class, on a group, in the sense of freedom, is measured by the strength of these barriers and the number and the importance of the paths which they keep open for their members, if not for all, for at any rate a great number for them. This is almost an the opposite pole from the purpose of those who believe in liberty in the positive, self-directed sense. The former want to curb authority as such, the latter want its place in their own hands. This is a cardinal issue. This is not two different interpretations of a single concept, but two profoundly divergent, irreconcilable attitudes to the ends of life. It is well to recognize this, even if in practice it is often necessary to strike a compromise between them, for each of them makes absolute claims. These claims cannot both be fully satisfied, but it is not profound lack of social and moral understanding not to recognize that as a satisfaction that each of them seeks is an ultimate value which both historically and morally has equal right to be classed among the deepest interests of mankind. 8. The one and the many. One belief more than any other is responsible for the slander of individuals on the altars for the great historical ideas, justice, or progress, or the happiness of future generations, or the sacred mission or emancipation of a nation or race or class, or even liberty itself, which demands the sacrifice of individual for the freedom of society. This is a belief that is somewhere in the past or in the future, in the revelation or in the minds of an individual thinker, in the pronouncements of history or science, in the simple heart and the uncorrupted good man, there is a final solution. This ancient faith rests on the conviction that all the positive values in which men have believed must, in the end, be compatible and perverse even entail one another. Nature binds truth, happiness, and virtue together, as by an indissoluble chain, said one of the best men who ever lived, and spoke in similar terms of liberty, equality, and justice. But is this true? It's commonplace that neither political equality, nor efficient organization, nor social justice is compatible with more than a modicum of individual liberty, and certainly not with unrestricted laissez-faire. The justice and generosity, public and private loyalties, the demands of genius and the claims of society can conflict violently with each other. It is no great way from that to the generalization that not all good things are compatible, still less all the ideal of mankind. Somewhere we shall be told, in some way it must be possible for all these values to live together. For unless this is so, the universe is not a cosmos, not a harmony. Unless this is so, conflicts of values may be an intrinsic, irremovable element to human life. To admit that the fulfillment of some of our ideas may in principle make the fulfillment of others impossible is to see that the notion for total human fulfillment is a formal contradiction, a metaphysical chimera. For every rationalist metaphysician, from Plato to the last disciples of Hegel or Marx, is this abandoned notion of a final harmony in which all riddles are solved, all contradictions reconciled, is a piece of crude empiricism, abdication before brutal facts, intolerable bankruptcy of reason before things as they are, failure to explain and to justify, to reduce everything to a system which reason indignantly rejects. But if we are not armed with an a priori guarantee for the proposition of the total harmony of the true values, is somewhere to be found, perhaps in some ideal realm, the characteristic of which we can, in our finite state, not so much as conceive. We must fall back on the ordinary resources of empirical observation and the ordinary human knowledge. And this certainly gives us no warrant for supposing or even understanding what would be meant by saying that all good things and all bad things, for that matter, are reconcilable with each other. The world that we encounter in ordinary experience is one in which we are faced with choices between ends equally ultimate, the claims equally absolute, realization of some of which must inevitably involve the sacrifice of others. Indeed, it is because this is the situation that man places such immense value upon the freedom to choose. For if they had assurance that in some perfect state realizable by man on earth, no ends pursued by them would ever be in conflict, necessity and agony of choice would disappear, and with it the central importance of the freedom to choose. Any method of bringing this final state nearer would then seem fully justified, no matter how much freedom was sacrificed to forward this advance. It is, I have no doubt, some such dogmatic certainty that has been responsible for the deep, serene, unshakable conviction in the minds of some of the most merciless tyrant and persecutor in history that what they did was fully justified by its purpose. I don't see the ideal of a self-profession, whether for individuals or nations or churches or classes, to be condemned in itself, or that the language which was used in its defense was in all cases a result of confused or fraudulent use of words, or a moral or intellectual perversity indeed, and try to show that it is the notion of freedom, its a positive sense that is at the heart of demands for national or social self-direction which animate the most powerful and morally just public movements of our time, is that not recognize this is to misunderstand the most vital facts, ideas of our age. But equally seems to me that the belief that some single formula can in principle be found whereby all the diverse ends of man can be harmoniously realized is demonstrably false. If, as I believe, the ends of man are many, and not all of them are in principle compatible with each other, then the possibility for conflict and of tragedy can never wholly be eliminated from human life. Either personal or social, the necessity for choosing between absolute claims is then an inescapable characteristic for the human condition. This gives value to freedom as action, as conceit of it, as the end in itself, and not as a temporal need arising out of our confused notions and irrational and disorderly lives, a predicament which Panachian would one day put right. I do not wish to see that individual freedom is even in the most liberal societies the sole or even the dominant criterion of social action. We compel children to be educated. We forbade public executions. These are certainly curbs to freedom. We justify them on the ground that ignorance or barbarian upbringing or cruel pleasures and excitements are worse for us than the amount of restraint needed to repress them. This judgment, in turn, depends on how we determine good and evil, that is to say, on our moral, religious, intellectual, economic, and aesthetic values, which are, in their own turn, bound up with our conception of man and with the base demands of his nature. In other words, our solution to such problems is based on our vision, by which we are consciously or unconsciously guided by of what constitutes a fulfilled human life, as contrasted with Miller's crabbed and warped, pitched, and hidebound natures. And to protest against the laws governing censorship, personal morals, as intolerable infringements of personal liberty, presuppose a belief that the activity which such law forbid are fundamental needs of man as man in a good or indeed any society. To defend such laws to hold that these needs are not essential, and that they can be satisfied without the sacrifice of other values which come higher, satisfy deeper needs, that individual freedom, determined by some standards that is not merely subjective, standard for which some object standards, empirical or a priori, is acclaimed. The extent of man's on the people's liberty to choose, to live as they desire, must be win against the claims of many other values, of which equality or justice or happiness or security or public order are perhaps the most obvious examples. For this reason, it cannot be unlimited. We are rightly reminded by R. H. Tawney that the liberty for the strong, whether their strength is physical or economic, must be restrained. This maximum claim respect, not as a consequence of some a priori rule whereby the respect for the liberty of one man logically entails respect for the liberty of others like him, but simply because respect for the principle of justice or shame and the gross inequality of treatment is as basic in man as desire for liberty. Though cannot have everything is a necessary, not a contingent truth. Burke's plea for the constant need to compensate or reconcile to balance. Mill's plea for novel experiments in living with the permanent possibility of error. Knowledge that it is not merely impractical but in principle impossible to reach clear-cut and certain answers, even in an ideal world of a wholly good and rational men and wholly clear ideas, may band those who seek for final solutions single or embracing systems, guaranteed to be internal. Nevertheless, it is a conclusion that cannot be escaped by those who, with Kant, have learned the truth that out of the crooked timbers of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. There is little need to stress the fact that monism and faith in the single criterion have always proved a deeper source of satisfaction both to the intellect and to the emotions, whether the standard for judgment derived from the vision of some future profession, or in the minds of the philosophies in the 18th century and their technocratic successors in our own day, or is rooted in the past, latere est les morts, as maintained by German historicists or French theocrats or neoconservatives in English-speaking countries, it's bound, provided it is inflexible enough to encounter some unforeseen and foreseeable human development, which it will not fade, and will then be used to justify the a priori barbarities of procrusticides the vivisecting of actual society in some fixed pattern dictated by a fallible standing of a largely imaginary past on a wholly imaginary future, to preserve our absolute categories or ideals and expense of human life offends equally against the principles of science and of history. It is attitude to found the equal measure on the right and left winds in our days. It is not reconcilable with the principle accepted by those who respect the facts. Pluralism was the measure of native liberty that is entails into me a truer and more humane idea than the goals of those who are seeking the great disciplined authoritarian structures. The ideal of a positive self-mastery by classes or peoples or the whole of mankind is truer because it does at least recognize the fact that human goals are many and all of them commensurable and in perpetual rivalry with one another, to assume that all values can be graded on one scale, so that it is a mere matter of inspection to determine the highest seems to me to falsify our knowledge that men are free agent, to represent moral decision as operation which a slight role could in principle perform, to see that in some ultimate, all reconciling, yet realizable synthesis, duty is interest, or individual freedom is a pure democracy, on an authoritarian standards, states is to throw a metaphysical blanket over either self-deceit or deliberate hypocrisy. It's more humane because it does not, as a system builder do, deprive man in the name of some remote or incoherent ideal of much that they have found to be indispensable to their life as unpredictably self-transforming human beings. In the end, men choose between ultimate values. They choose as they do because their life and thoughts are determined by fundamental moral categories and concepts that are at any rate over large stretches of time and space apart. Their being and thought and sense of their own identity, part of what makes them human. It may be that the ideal of freedom to choose ends without claiming internal validity for them, and the pluralism of values connected with this is only the late fruit of our declining capitalist civilization, an ideal which remote ages and primitive society have not recognized, and one which posterity will regard with curiosity, even sympathy, but little comprehension. This may be so, but no spectacle conclusions seem to me to follow. Principle is not less secret because the duration cannot be guaranteed. Indeed, the world desire for guarantees that our values are internal and secure in some object haven. Object heaven is perhaps only a craving for the certainties of childhood or absolute values of our primitive past. To realize the relative validity of one's convictions, said an admirable writer of our time, yet stand for them unflinchingly, is what distinguishes a civilized man from a barbarian. To demand more than this is perhaps a deep and incurable metaphysical need, but to allow it to determine one's practice as a symptom of equal deep and more dangerous moral and political immaturity. The end of the essay.